All right, Alexander, let's do a general update as to what's going on in Ukraine. And let's start with what's going on the ground because we have some developments. The first one is the warship, the Moskva. Something happened to it. The more information I'm getting, the more I'm coming to the belief that the Russian narrative is probably more accurate, though I don't know if it's the truth. But the fact that some accident or something happened, something negligent, maybe even some sort of type of sabotage. But the more info I'm getting, the more I'm understanding this is not two Neptune anti-ship missiles. Because if that was the case, then the 500 people on board, in my opinion, would not be evacuated and would not be alive. In other words, there would be some casualties. And I think if there were missiles involved, you wouldn't have the ability to evacuate those people in such a what appears to be a very orderly and calm manner. Plus, you have the Ministry of Defense saying that the ship is being towed back to the harbor. It's not going to be usable, so to speak, but it's not going to be sunk either. So that, to me, in my mind, that hints at something happening. Either way, it's not a good look for Russia. It's not a good look at all. And, it's an old ship. It's 40 years old, but still, it doesn't look good. And Ukraine is going to use it for a PR win. They're going to say that they sent missiles and they sunk it. And, okay, they control all the soft power, so a lot of people are going to buy into that. You have that news, and I think you have the other important news, which I find interesting, is the Ministry of Defense of Russia. They came out with a statement yesterday, and they said that if Ukraine continues to provoke Russia by entering Russian territory or trying to enter Russian territory or trying to strike Russian territory via drone or helicopter or missiles, then Russia will strike at Kiev's central commands or their command and order facilities. The reason I bring this up is I have to think to myself, are you telling me that Russia is in a war and you're allowing these central command locations to operate without taking them out, without impeding them, without going after them? Are you kidding me? I mean, if you're Russia, I don't know. I must be missing something. But the minute I heard this statement from the Russian Ministry of Defense, I thought to myself, you are trying to win this conflict. You're trying to denazify and demilitarize, but yet you are allowing these command stations that are giving all these orders sitting in Kiev to continue to operate without any problem. It sounds crazy to me. And if that really is the truth of it, or I'm misunderstanding something, then I don't know. I'm a little bit, what? That's crazy. But anyway, maybe I'm missing something. I thought those were the two big stories from yesterday. Of course, we have the surrendering of troops in Mariupol, and we have the battle in Donbass. But I mean, those are going along. I mean, it's happening day by day, and it is what it is.
Yes. Let me first of all deal with the Moskva. I've come to very much the same conclusion that you have. Obviously, it is a very bad look for Russia. It is the flagship of the Black Sea Fleet. It is a very old ship. It's 40 years old. Its missiles are old. I mean, they date from the 1970s. They're even older than the ship. And as I understand it, it hasn't actually launched any missiles or engaged in any direct combat operations. It's not actually taken an active combat role in the battle. And by the way, for what it's worth, it's also due to be scrapped anyway. It's apparently in preparation for being replaced. One of the ship that's being intended to replace it is already under construction, and it's one of these new helicopter carriers that the Russians are building in Crimea. So I'm inclined to think that you're right. I think this is an old ship. Apparently, it's not been particularly well refurbished because for many decades there wasn't very much refurbishment done to the Russian Navy. It was starved of funds. I think more likely than not, that's what the problem is. If it had been hit by anti-ship missiles, somebody surely would have died. Not just somebody, but a lot of people would have died. And more likely than not, the ship would have been sunk. So I think that the story is of an old ship, badly maintained, catching fire at the wrong moment and having to be towed back to port. And I am going to make a guess, since its replacement is already, on the slipways, or it is on the slipways, but is at least is being built. My guess is the Russians will scrap it, because I can't really see the logic of refurbishing such an old ship and bringing it back into service when its replacement is already being built. So that's what I'm going to say about that. Now, there's lots of things going to be said from one side to the other, but I think that's basically the underlying story. Now, about what the Russian Defense Ministry said, here I'm going to say that I interpreted it rather differently. What I understood that the Russian military was saying was that if these sabotage attacks, which are what they are, on Russian territory continue, what the Russians are going to do is they're going to go after Ukraine's political leaders. In other words, they'll be attacking Zelensky's office, they'll be targeting him personally and the other political leaders of Ukraine. In other words, they'll be making decapitation strikes against Ukraine's political leadership. Not so much its, military people who I suspect are in command bunkers and may very well, for all I know, be running things from, away from Kiev. So that was my understanding of it. But it is still remarkable that the Russians have not gone after the political leadership of Ukraine. It's completely unlike what the US does. US goes for decapitation strikes, but we've pointed out that this is what they have been doing right from the start of the war. Now, why the Russians have taken it like this, why they've decided to focus on not taking out decapitation strikes, I think it's because they've been trying to negotiate a settlement with Ukraine. I think they're becoming increasingly frustrated that that's not going to happen. And I wonder whether decapitation strikes may eventually start to take place, irrespective of what Ukraine does in Russia itself. And it did make me wonder whether perhaps, the Russians are gradually preparing the ground to do something like that. So, it may seem strange to people, but it's been absolutely obvious to me that that's been the Russian strategy right from the first day of not attacking these people. Of not attacking
the Russian strategy.
Yeah.
I understand how that could be the Russian strategy.
Yeah.
Okay, I can see how you come to that conclusion, even though I think the statement, maybe it's a translation issue then, because I think that the statement is, it surely sounds like they're talking about a command and control center.
Yeah.
Rather than political figures.
Yeah, I know that.
Once again, maybe this is a translation issue.
Yes.
Or maybe, or it would have surprised me that the Russian communications department kind of muddled it, because they seem to muddle many things. But if it is political figures, I can understand why. I can understand why you want to keep main political actors around so you can negotiate with them. Zelensky, it's obvious why you want to keep Zelensky around, so you can get him to sign the surrender papers. But given the fact that, two things, given the fact that negotiations now are pretty much dead, both according to Ukraine and according to the Russians, Lavrov and Putin, according to Ukraine, Zelensky and his guys have said negotiations are dead. According to the EU and Joseph Borrell, there is no other solution. It's only a military solution. The U.S. has been saying this for a while now. There is no negotiation. There's only a military solution. Given those facts, do the dynamics change now?
Yes.
And would that explain why Ukraine keeps on stringing along the Russians with negotiations? In other words, one minute they say we're close to a deal and then we're going to get everything worked out, and then the next minute they say, we don't agree. And no deal. And then they go back and say, okay, we're close to a deal because maybe these people understand that if we outright say no more negotiations, then they're going to take us out.
I think that's exactly why what the Ukrainians are doing. I think in Istanbul, the Ukrainians made some very, very big apparent concessions. And then they immediately, after hearing from Johnson and Biden and the US and all the rest and the EU, they started to walk them back. And I think if you look at Russian statements, the Russians feel extremely angry about it. Now, the Russians were extremely naive to assume that those concessions were real, even though they were set out apparently in an actual document. But anyway, the Russians are very, very angry about it. I'm going to come back to a point which I've made before. I think the major reason that the Russians have let themselves be strung along in this fashion is because of the diplomatic situation. I think that they have been in contact regularly with Beijing and New Delhi, and to some extent Ankara, all important countries, given that Russia is, as I said, involved in a conflict which, as they say, isn't just about Ukraine, it is with NATO. And they need these countries to remain on side with them. I think the governments of all of these countries have been saying that you have to conduct negotiations because that's our position, that's our long-standing position on all sorts of issues. China repeatedly says this. Wang Yi, the Chinese government, always says, that China supports negotiations between the two sides to come to a peaceful settlement. India says the same. Turkey, to some extent, does too, even as Turkey provides some arms to Ukraine. But they do keep the Black Sea closed. So I think the Russians have felt that they've had to play along with this because that's what their allies, and, let's be frank, China, India, at least, have turned out to be allies of Russia in this conflict. That's what their allies have wanted. I think Russian patience is stretching very thin. And if I may say so, there was another statement that Russia made 2 days ago, which came from their Deputy Foreign Minister, Sergei Ryabkov, which I think was another sign that their patience is stretching very thin, which is that they said that they will consider any NATO convoys in Ukraine delivering arms to be legitimate targets. Now, they've said that before, but it clearly signals that they're now going to start stepping up strikes against Western convoys entering Ukraine with fresh weapons. And I think that was a clear threat and not just a threat. I think that's a clear signal that they're going to step up doing that, as they did when they destroyed that S-300 system in Dnipro the other day. So I think the Russian patience is running very thin. I think Putin has almost certainly been on the phone to Xi Jinping, explaining all of this. I think that the Russians have been circulating their concerns about what the Ukrainians are doing to their various allies. And I think that I'm quite sure, by the way, that my understanding of what they said, that it was the political leadership that they were targeting, is the correct one.
Well, just to be more accurate, I think I've got a translation here, which is coming from the Telegram channel of Inessa. Inessa has she's very, very good at getting the context of translations correct. And in this translation, it's an interview with Zelensky's close friend and aide, Arestowicz. He's kind of like the Baghdad Bob of this whole scenario. He's a first-class BSer, a kind of joker of a fellow, and an entertainer. Yeah. All these guys, we got to remember, everyone in and around Zelensky, they're all entertainers. They're all producers and directors and script writers. I mean, that's not an exaggeration. I mean, that's really what they do. These are our TV, theater, script writer entertainers, and now they're in this war. It's really bizarre what's going on. But Arestowicz is one of these guys. He is the Baghdad Bob, and he was doing an interview, and Inessa has the translation in this interview where Arestowicz is saying that if Russia is going to hit their decision-making centers, then Ukraine is going to hit them back and pretty much hit them back hard. I mean, obviously he's BSing again. He says Arestovich claims Ukraine has the capability to really strike hard at Russia, Russian territory. I mean, not Russia, Russian territory. But he calls it, if Russia dares to hit decision-making centers.
Yes, yes, yes. Well, as I said, decision-making centres sounds to me like the political leadership ultimately, and I think that's really what is because the political leadership makes the decisions, the military leadership is supposed to execute them. That's the sort of layer that it's been going through. But I mean, his threat, I would treat as a bluff. I mean, about a couple of days ago, I was watching actually on British television, Ukrainian discussions about how they were going to send their army, north through Kharkiv region all the way to Belgorod and encircle the Russians in Donbass. I mean, things that, look to me bizarrely far-fetched. You remember there was the Kherson offensive of about 2 weeks ago, was it a week ago? I can't remember. They say lots of things which we mustn't take completely seriously. But the fact that he's coming out and talking in that way, I suspect, well, as you said, it's BS. But I think it does highlight what the real threat is. And I'm pretty sure, by the way, the Russians have conveyed that threat through other means to the Ukrainians as well. My understanding about what's been happening in Belgorod region. Belgorod region is the part of Russia where the Russians assemble most of their forces before they're fed into Donbass. That's where the big logistical hub that's supporting this operation is located. That most of what's been going on is, occasional helicopters going in, as we saw 2 weeks ago. Was it a week ago? I can't remember now. Hitting that oil facility, drones flying, buzzing around, perhaps the odd sabotage group trying to disrupt railway lines. It's something that the Russians are obviously concerned about, but it's not a fundamental military threat. And the fact that the Russians have upped up the temperature on this, I think it's perhaps again related to a direct warning to the Ukrainians, the Ukrainian leaders. Look, we have you in our sights. We know where you are. If you continue along these lines, not just with what you're doing in Belgorod, but stringing us along in negotiations when we're prepared to take a much harder line, what might for you be a mortally dangerous line than we have up to this point. We are running out of patience, and you need to start concentrating more on what your position is. I still have to say this. I think many Russians, in fact, not just many Russians, I think the vast majority of Russians are utterly exasperated by the self-restraint that their leadership is showing. And I'm pretty sure that the Russian military are unhappy about it also. I cannot imagine that the commanders on the ground aren't complaining about all of this to the Kremlin all the time. And by the way, this isn't the first time. I can remember also that during the Syrian war, exactly the same thing was happening. The military commanders, the Russian military commanders in Syria at the time of the fighting in and around Aleppo, were absolutely exasperated with the way in which Putin was agreeing ceasefires and stops and humanitarian corridors around Aleppo, and was, as the commanders on the ground felt, disrupting the operation, the actual ground operation. So I'm sure there's an awful lot of that going on. And I remember in the case of Syria, the actual complaints against Putin eventually became public. Ex-military people, but obviously put up to do it by some of the military commanders, actually started to come out and speak openly about their frustrations with what Putin was doing. Very unusual in Russia for that to happen. And I wouldn't be surprised if we start to see it before very long again, because obviously in this war, the stakes are so much higher.
Yeah, I think even though Putin has, say, an 83, 85% favorable popularity rating right now in Russia, there are a lot of people that are starting to get very, very tired of the restraint. I'm saying what the people in Russia and also many of the military officials, I think they're getting tired of the soft approach, and they get tired of guys like Arestovich, like these types of joker, TV producer types, almost antagonizing them. The video that Zelensky put out the other day with Medvedchuk was very antagonizing. I mean, he was making fun of the Russians, talking about Gagarin and cosmonauts. And I think that people are starting to get very frustrated with Vladimir Putin. I mean, it sounds weird to say, but it's almost like the Russian population and many of the generals are just kind of saying enough of this soft stuff. You're too soft, Vladimir, is kind of how I'm picturing it, which is, I mean, people in the West are going to probably hear me and say, what, Vladimir Putin too soft? But I'm just giving you what the sense is from the Russian side of things.
There is no question about it. There is absolutely no. I mean, we talk about this 83% approval rating. I think people need to understand how incredibly conditional that is. I mean, they rallied to him because he's the leader of the country at a time of war. But that doesn't mean that, behind that 83%, there isn't an awful lot of criticism as well. And an awful lot of people, and as I said, a lot of people, I'm sure, in the military, if they were prepared to come out and say as much, must be very, very frustrated that people like Arestovich, who I completely agree with your characterization of him, and indeed Zelensky himself, are able to, roam around Kiev, hold these kind of bizarre press conferences and interviews, and say all these extraordinary things which goad the Russians to the extent that they do. So I think that Putin tried to explain things when he went to the Cosmodrome, Vostochny Cosmodrome. You remember those comments that he made whilst he was there? He was asked a question by a Russian newspaper, Kommersant, can we not speed up the tempo? And he said, we've got to respond calmly, we've got to act systematically. What he was actually doing, and I think people didn't quite grasp this, he was responding to criticism from within Russia. Russians are, clearly, and, people can write to the Kremlin, it's like they can write to the White House. And I'm sure there's a massive deluge of letters and telegrams, well, not telegrams, but anyway, messages pouring into the Kremlin from all kinds of people, saying to them, why aren't we not taking a harder approach with these people? And, perhaps sooner or later he will start to do that. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if he did. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I don't think he has much of a choice, to be quite honest. And I understand, the goal is to minimize civilian casualties, absolutely, and to preserve infrastructure and administrative architecture and the administrative system, absolutely. Yes, absolutely. But I think politically he's getting a lot of heat, Putin, a lot of heat, and I just don't know how long he'll be able to carry on. And I have to say, closing the video, that one of the problems, going back to the fact that he's also trying to balance the geopolitical feelings of China, India, and Turkey, two problems I see with that by not going in and being more decisive in this conflict is that, three things. Number one, this is a conflict. So if you make the decision to go in and accomplish your goals, demilitarization, denazification, I would imagine that you can't tiptoe around this. I mean, you better go and try to accomplish your goals. That's how I would see it. Once again, we're not sitting at the Kremlin, and we don't know what the hell they're saying or how they're going about this. But the other two things I would say is that, fine, he's talking to China, he's talking to India, he's talking to Turkey. But I would imagine that China, India, and Turkey better realize that if Russia doesn't accomplish their goals, well, they are next. The U.S. has said as much. They're going after China. There's no doubt about that. They've admitted it. Turkey is definitely in the crosshairs of the neocons and the neolibs in D.C. And India is now about to step on the sanctions escalator, and
absolutely,
they would like a nice regime change in India as well. So, India and China and Turkey can tell Russia, please don't go in hard. Please, pretend that you're negotiating or show that you're negotiating in order for us to save diplomatic face. But they must also realize that, you know what, you better win this now because, the neocons, they're going to come after us. So just win this thing. That's the first, that's the second comment. And finally, the last comment I'm going to make is he also has a problem inside the Kremlin because he has a lot of people in the Kremlin who have a lot of interests in many of these countries, most notably, for example, Turkey and Peskov and Shoigu, who have very conflicting connections to Turkey, and I think this may cloud a lot of their judgment as well. I'm not saying it does. I say it may. It may. I'm not saying it does. I'm saying it may.
But to answer your second point first, I think unquestionably it does. I get the sense that Shoigu, who is after all the defense minister, is probably fully committed. But there are other people like Peskov whom I'm sure are not. And Peskov is only one person. I'm sure there's a big establishment grouping within Russia which wants to keep Turkey on side. It's the only explanation for what has otherwise been an incredibly conciliatory policy from Moscow towards Turkey, despite endless provocations from the Turks. So I think it does affect Russian policy. Of that, there is no question at all. Now, as to the other two powers, well, I read the Chinese media every day. I read the Chinese, not just Global Times, by the way, which is the one I cite because it's the most forthright and the clearest, but all of them. And what I'm going to say straight away is this: the Chinese are getting harder every day. Their support for Russia is becoming more and more outspoken. They are rapidly coming round to the conclusion that the talks are going nowhere. They're blaming the United States for the failure of the talks. I saw a long article in Global Times which essentially said so. I think the Chinese are almost on side. India, more complicated, and I don't pretend I'm as familiar with what is being said in India as I am with China. So I think that the diplomacy, because of course, after all, ultimately it's China that really matters, I think that the diplomacy is gradually enabling the Russians to take a harder line altogether, and I suspect they probably will at some point. Now, having said that, as I said, it is utterly exasperating for many Russians to see, people like Zelensky being able to hold court in Kiev in the way that he does. People should never underestimate political pressures within Russia itself. They are growing all the time, except not in the direction that I think some people in the West think. And this isn't, something that I'm wrong about. I'm wrong about. I can read what Russians are saying. There's a very interesting article by Paul Robertson, the Canadian academic, who said that pro-Western voices in Russia have just basically been stilled. The Eurasianists, the Russia Firsters, have completely won, and probably permanently. There's no significant constituency amongst the Russian population. There may be a few business people and intellectuals, but no significant constituency within the Russian population that wants to see things taken softer. They want things to be taken a lot harder, and ultimately they're the people that Putin has to listen to.
Yeah, no, let's see what happens then. No doubt Putin is going to have to make some difficult decisions in the next few days. I don't think he has that much time.
No, I don't think he has
decisions.
Yeah.
Yeah, those decisions. In times like this in Russia, when the Russian leadership gets into these critical decision moments, you kind of think to yourself, I hope these leaders don't end up making the same mistakes that Russian leaders of the past made, and
indeed,
you end up with events like
1917,
Tsar Nicholas, for example.
Yeah, exactly.
Exactly. Where you fail to make decisions in one way or another. I'm not saying in either direction, and you kind of sit in the middle, and that's when the forces at work kind of take you out.
I absolutely agree. But can I just say, I mean, the two, for me, the big, if you want to talk about Russian history, the two examples to look at were first Alexander I, who was the Tsar, who was the Tsar at the time when Napoleon invaded Russia. And he also, many Russians during that time also felt that Alexander was being far too weak, far too conciliatory to Napoleon. There were concerns right up to the moment, when Moscow was occupied, that Alexander would sue for peace. There were threats to overthrow him if he did. Eventually, it became clear that he was fully committed. And by the way, may surprise people to know the same thing happened during the Second World War. In 1941, after the German invasion, there were lots of concerns in Russia that Stalin would do another peace deal with Hitler. And again, it became increasingly clear that the population in Russia would not have accepted it. And if Stalin ever had any such ideas, which it seems unlikely, he would have faced serious political problems in Russia too. So I think that, he's got to look at that. I'm going to also suggest another person who found himself in a war-type situation, which is, this will probably upset some Americans, but very different country, very different political leader. But Lincoln, of course, during the Civil War, the American Civil War, was repeatedly criticized for taking an over-conciliatory line. If you read his first inaugural address, he seemed to be talking as if the US military was simply going to go into the South to protect federal property. But eventually, under pressure, he hardened his line all the time. I think we're going to see exactly the same with Putin.
All right, we will leave it there. TheDuran.locals.com. If you're watching this from Rumble, you will see a red maroon button up top. Click on that button, and that'll take you to our locals community and the Duran shop. Use the code GOODDAY. Get 10% off all merchandise. The code is GOODDAY. Take care.